Okay, well, welcome to Funding Your Digitization Project. Hello, and welcome to the 5th class in the Library of Michigan's Digitization Basics webinar series, Funding Your Digitization Project. We're officially halfway through. So I'm Biz Gallo, the statewide Digitization Initiatives Coordinator, and my job is to help libraries and cultural heritage institutions throughout Michigan digitize their collections and make them accessible. In order to help the state prepare to do so, we've created this 9-part series that will lay the foundation for digitizing your collections. You can see the lists of the other classes in the series here, which are held on the last Tuesday of each month, and we'll drop a link for registration in the chat now. You can register for all of the courses or for only the ones that are of particular interest to you, whether it's to learn new skills or as a refresher. After the series, there will be more in-depth classes offered, both on topics covered in this series as well as a variety of other topics. For example, we'll have format-specific classes, such as digitizing newspapers, scrapbooks, or audiovisual material. We'll have resource-centered classes, such as working with vendors, working with interns and volunteers, and building a community archives. We'll also have procedural classes, such as writing digitization grant applications and creating digital exhibits. If there's anything you're particularly interested in, please let me know so I can develop programming around those topics. In addition to the Digitization Basics webinar series, we'll be developing niche academy modules from the material covered in the series so that you can hone your skills and earn badges in digitization. I'd like to go over a little bit of housekeeping before we start. This webinar is being recorded, so you can access the content again later along with the slides. This recording should be available next week, allowing time for captioning. If you missed any of the previous classes, you can view the recordings by going to the Library of Michigan's webinar archive. There will be time for Q&A at the end, but please feel free to ask questions throughout. And if you have any technical or audio issues, please reach out to Becky in the chat so that she can help resolve them. And last, there are many additional resources on the digitization page of the Library of Michigan's website. Today, we'll be looking at a few topics around funding. We'll be looking at cost considerations for a digitization project, grant funding opportunities for digitizing your collections, and non-traditional options for funding digitization projects. Okay. And as always, I like to start with a little poll. So Becky, if you wouldn't mind starting the poll, I'd like to ask, how do you fund digitization at your organization? Do you apply for grants? Do you include it as a line item in your budget? Do you ask for donations from your community? Is there another method that you request, or all of the above? So why don't you go ahead and make your selection there. Okay. Grant funding, budget, donation, other, and all of the above. Wow, that is a really pretty even spread. I'm interested to hear from those that marked other. If you want to drop in the chat some of the things that you do to fund your digitization projects, I'd love to hear it. And I'm sure that others on this call would like ideas too. Yep, Cynthia says no fundraising yet. Well, hopefully this webinar will help give you some options for that. Yeah. All right, great. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing. Close out. Great. Well, however you're planning to fund your digitization project, you'll need to know how much money you need to apply for, how much money you need to budget for, or how much money you would need to raise. So let's start by going over the factors to consider when building a digitization budget. Every project, just like every organization, is unique. It would be impossible to say definitively how much a digitization project would cost because of the many factors involved, but we can make some general assumptions about impacts on overall budgets. First, common formats such as unbound documents or photographs tend to have a lower cost than digitizing rare or specialized formats such as scrapbooks or audiovisual material. This is due to the type of equipment used, the expertise required, and the amount of time needed per object. Think about the time it would take to put a stack of papers through a sheet feeding style scanner. This is something that could be done in most offices with relatively low technical expertise needed and practically no individual attention. Let's compare that to a wax cylinder audio recording. There are only a handful of machines available to play back that format, and it requires a high skill level and a great deal of attention in order to digitize. Next is condition of the material to be digitized. Material in good condition will cost less to digitize than material in poor condition. Anytime you need to clean or perform conservation work on material, it will increase time and therefore costs associated with the project. If you need to remove mold, dirt, or glue, or repair damage, it takes time and often specialized work to be done. And even if you don't perform any of the conservation work on this material, deteriorating, fragile, or brittle items require additional attention and more careful handling than their counterparts in good condition. Third, homogeneous collections, or collections where all of the material is the same basic size and format, will have a lower cost than a collection with many or varied formats, sizes, and conditions. If you don't have to take time to constantly change settings on a scanner or go back and forth between adapters or even equipment, the amount of time that each scan takes is less, and therefore its associated cost is less. There's also a lower chance of having to fix or redo work if scanning setups are unchanged. Next, simple projects will often cost less than complex ones. For example, digitizing a scrapbook or a book with foldouts of fragile maps will take more time and possibly different equipment than handling a project of, say, 35mm film slides. If you have an oral history spread across 5 tapes that need to be edited together, that will cost more than a recording on a single tape. The more complex a project is, the more workflows are needed, the more time may be required, and the overall cost of a project increases accordingly. Last, and this may sound or seem counterintuitive, but the more material digitized, the lower the cost to digitize each item. For example, let's say you purchased a $500 scanner to digitize a collection of photographs. If you have 1,000 photographs to digitize, the cost of equipment for those photographs is 50 cents each. But let's say you only have 100 photographs to digitize. The cost of equipment to digitize those photographs is $5 each. Aside from the equipment costs, there are also reduced labor costs in digitizing more items. Let's say you sit down to scan something at your computer. There are always going to be basic processes that need to happen. Turning on your computer, turning on the scanner, assigning settings, gathering a box of material. These are all the setup tasks that you would need to do whether you're digitizing a single item or many. But the more you digitize, the more items that time of initial setup can be amortized over. This type of cost can be hard to see, especially if you're digitizing in-house. If you're using a vendor for digitization, you'll quickly see the cost difference if you get a quote for 5 items or 500 when you look at the unit price. The more material you have to digitize, the lower the unit cost for each item. So now that we've reviewed some of the factors that can impact costs, let's break down these costs into 2 basic groups: upfront costs and ongoing costs, as both will need to be considered when you're building a digitization budget. Upfront costs are costs needed to complete the actual digitization work. These are usually easier to determine and would include costs for equipment and supplies, labor, and the physical space to undertake the work. Ongoing costs are costs needed to support the digitization work over time. These are often harder to estimate and would include costs like equipment maintenance, digital storage, and digital preservation and access. Let's look a little closer at each of these costs. Any digitization project will require equipment to convert the analog material into digital form. But the type of equipment required can vary widely based on the type of material to be digitized, the budget of the organization, and whether this is for a specific project or an ongoing program. If this is for a specific project and you're unlikely to have ongoing digitization beyond ad hoc scanning, you would likely not want to invest in a costly scanner that will get little use beyond the immediate project. Alternatively, if you're planning to build an ongoing digitization program where material will be scanned consistently over time, it would likely be worth the additional investment in higher-end equipment that will keep up with your needs. Beyond the scanner, you'll need a computer. Like with the scanner, the computer you use might depend on the type of material you're scanning. For text documents, you wouldn't need more than a common PC. But if you're scanning photographs, large or complex objects, or audiovisual material, you may want to invest in a computer that has more processing power or a graphics card. You may also want to consider having an additional monitor or two for your computer, depending on the type of material you're scanning. Additional monitors will make organizing your files and workspaces easier and will come in handy if you're doing any photo editing. The last bit of hardware you'll need to purchase is digital storage, such as hard drives or server space. Remember the 3-2-1 rule. You'll want to have 3 copies of your files on 2 different storage media, one of which is off-site. Keep this in mind as you're planning on what type of digital storage you'll need to purchase. In addition to the hardware, you'll want to add in any other supplies you may need for digitization. Depending on the material you're digitizing, you may want to purchase nitrile gloves for handling photographs or slides, glass cleaning supplies for your scanner or camera, color and grayscale guides for quality control, or slide and transparency adapters. As you're building your budget, you may also want to include rehousing materials, as digitization is a great time to rehouse material that needs it, as you'll already be handling items individually. You can take material out of dirty, damaged, or deteriorating housing and place it in new housing with very little time added to the process. That could be folders, sleeves, or boxes. Once you have files, you'll also need software for post-processing and management of those files. If you'll only need simple editing like deskewing or cropping, most of the software that comes with scanners will have that included. If you're planning on doing more advanced work with the files like photo editing, optical character recognition, or bulk file management, you'll likely need to have additional software. Beyond file processing, you will need to be able to manage your files over time and provide access to them. Collections management systems, digital asset management systems, and hosting platforms should be considered as you plan for your project's budget. There are software options ranging from free and open source to expensive proprietary systems and everything in between. So be sure to explore all of the options available to select a platform that will suit your organization's individual needs. When looking at labor, it can be broken down into paying your own staff or paying a vendor to digitize material, or some combination of the two. If you're digitizing in-house, you'll have your own staff to pay for their time. This will not only be time spent digitizing, but also likely training them on how to digitize material. This would either be their salary or hourly wages plus benefits. If you're using a vendor to do the digitization and perhaps some of the additional tasks related, you will still need to consider the cost of your own staff as they prepare material to go to a vendor and the downstream work when the material comes back. But the staff time will be less, both in the time it takes to prepare material and not having to pay to train, but you are paying for the skills and expertise from the vendor, so the labor is merely displaced. The cost of the services from a vendor will be provided to you. Knowing how much to budget for that is the easy part. But how do you calculate the cost of work that your own staff will be doing? A helpful tool is the Digital Library Federation's Digitization Cost Calculator. This tool runs on a community-contributed data to provide estimates of time and cost to those planning digitization projects. It allows you to enter individual staff, their rate of pay, whether they're hourly or salaried, and include their benefits in the calculation of costs. You can select the type of equipment that you're using and assign staff to each of the processes involved in order to estimate the amount of time and money the project will cost. Let's take a closer look at the kinds of processes that we would need to account for in this labor calculation. It's easy to say, I can throw a photo on a scanner and get a file 30 seconds later. This is true, and that will work for many needs. But if your goal is to create lasting, accessible digital collections, there is a bit more work involved on both the front and back end of that process. Consider the preparation work that would need to be done in order to get material ready to be scanned. You'll need to prepare and arrange material, both physically and intellectually, before you scan. Taking the time to organize material by type or size will help make your workflow more streamlined and efficient later on. Organizing collections ahead of time will also help you easily group material together for better file management without having to stop and assign unique file names constantly. The digitization itself takes time, but it's small in comparison with all the other work that needs to be done. In addition, depending on the type of material to be digitized, it can be scanned in a matter of seconds or minutes or hours if it's real-time like time-based media. Once material is digitized, you could have anywhere from minimal post-processing, such as cropping, deskewing, and making derivatives, to more time-consuming post-processing, like extensive photo editing, optical character recognition, or manual transcription. Depending on the type of material, this sort of work can take hours, but is often necessary to ensure usable, accessible content. Once you're done creating files, you'll want to check that you did it right. Quality control takes time. Some of the more objective quality control work can be done using automated tools, which will save you time. But the subjective work is still best done by humans. Work like this would be checking to make sure the scans are complete, that nothing is cut off, the image is in focus, and of the correct content. This sort of work, while minimal, takes time. It's generally considered that a third of your time on a digitization project is spent planning and project management. A third of your time is spent actually scanning, and then the last third is spent on metadata. Cataloging and metadata creation is time-intensive work, but it's essential when creating accessible, discoverable collections that will be useful and meaningful to researchers. All right, you're almost done, but not quite. You know all those boxes you pulled out or those items you pulled from their folders for better organization? Those now all need to be put back together and replaced and put back on the shelves. Now that you have your files, you'll need to provide access to them. Are you just adding them to an existing collection, or are you building a digital exhibit from scratch? Is this something that you have the in-house infrastructure to support, or you need to develop this with an outside service provider? Be sure to plan for the development and implementation time for making your collections available online when you're looking at your budget. Last, but certainly not least, is digital preservation and file management over time. You'll need to store and check backups, run fixity checks, and eventually migrate files to different carriers and formats. So whether you're using the digitization cost calculator or another tool, another great tool you can use to get an accurate estimate of the amount of time a project will take and therefore cost is to do a pilot. Once you've digitized content and gathered data on all of these processes, you can extrapolate the cost of the whole project based on your scanners, your staff, and your infrastructure. But what if you're using a vendor? Many of these processes are still required even when using a vendor. However, if you are working with a service provider, it can be easier to put a specific dollar amount on certain parts of the digitization project. Whether you are quoted an amount to digitize a specific project or you're getting as much done as you can within a given budget, there's a defined dollar amount you'll be working with. There can be, and often is, unforeseen costs associated with using a service provider. Consider shipping costs to get your material both to and from the vendor, as well as needing to buy boxes sturdy enough for shipping, depending on how heavy your materials are. There's also digital storage costs for transferring files, whether you're purchasing a hard drive from the vendor or using cloud-based storage options. Format misidentification can definitely add cost to a project. You might think you're sending out microfilm to be digitized and then find out it's actually motion picture film, or vice versa, or something totally different. Maybe the condition is not what you thought. Something that might appear in good shape upon initial inspection might reveal mold or insect contamination at the item level that would need to be addressed before it can be digitized. You may also be off on your item count, and being over or under could change your unit price as well as the overall cost. Last, if you change the scope or specifications for a project, this will also likely change the costs associated with it. So how do we prepare for these unforeseen costs? It's always a good idea to build in a buffer. Any budget that you build, whether you're digitizing in-house or using a vendor, should have a 10 to 20% buffer included, depending on the type and size of material. But assuming a project with a vendor may cost up to 10% more than quoted will help reduce surprises. Be sure to get quotes from multiple vendors and compare them. You'll be able to see what's included in this quote that wasn't in the other, and vice versa. By getting multiple quotes, you can compare apples to apples and make sure that you're making the best selection. Check references. It's always a good idea to ask for references if they don't provide them, but you can always ask for specific references for projects that match the size, type, or organization that's similar to your own, so you can get an idea for what it's like to work with them for a project that's more similar to yours. Last, always ask for a pilot. This will help make sure that what you're asking for is what you're getting, and what you're getting is what you actually want or need, and that you can make changes early in the process. Because even if you use a vendor, you'll still need to perform your own level of quality assurance on those files. This way, you can use the pilot to ensure that you have the required skills, equipment, and resources to verify that what you've requested is what you've received. The last of the upfront costs to consider is physical space. Do you have enough space to undertake this project? Equipment can be bulky, and you'll need a large enough workspace not only for the equipment, but also to properly stage and handle material. Consider if you're able to devote an area to this project for a given period of time or program indefinitely. If not, do you need to rent or acquire a space to do the work? If you need to use a shared space, constantly setting up or moving equipment can add a lot of time to your process, and depending on the type of equipment being used, this might not even be possible. Depending on the type of digitization project, it may be necessary to paint your walls, to have additional power supplies available, or even more. So when you're building a budget, consider the cost of making an existing space suit your needs or acquiring a space. All right, so now that we've looked at the upfront costs associated with digitization projects, let's consider some of the ongoing costs we'll need to plan for in our budgets. These are especially important as many of these ongoing costs wouldn't be covered if you're using grant funds for a project, as grants usually only cover expenses during that grant period. So it's important to build in financial support for these items to your budget, either through a line item or through other fundraising sources. First, let's look at digital storage. Now that you have your files, you'll need to store them. We've already talked about the 3-2-1 rule and having multiple copies of your files. But even beyond that, you'll likely have files stored on hard drives, which will need to be replaced every 3 to 5 years as hardware breaks down. Please don't consider that if you have files saved to a hard drive that sitting on a shelf that your material is preserved indefinitely. Those will need just as much attention as other material. Another alternative to digital storage is LTO tape. These magnetic tapes will last much longer than hard drives physically, but as new generations of LTO tape drives come out, they aren't indefinitely backwards compatible. So although these tapes themselves will last for decades, it's often recommended that you migrate tapes to the newer generation every few generations. If you're storing files on a local server, consider the costs of maintaining that server over time, such as upgrading storage or updating hardware. If you're using cloud storage, you'll have a cost not only for how much you store, but also there is often a fee when you access that content. Can you anticipate your access needs for those files to help you plan for associated costs down the line? This is definitely something to consider and to discuss with your service provider. Like with cloud storage, if you're using preservation storage solution, there will also be an ongoing fee to use this service. So make sure that you know what those costs are up front so you can plan and budget for them into the future. On a positive note, digital storage has become more and more affordable. However, digital storage uses up precious resources that will eventually run out. So as you upgrade or migrate your digital storage, please try to recycle as much as possible. Next is maintenance. If you used a vendor or borrowed equipment, this shouldn't be an issue as you won't have to undertake the cost of maintaining or upgrading your equipment over time. However, if you purchased equipment and will be digitizing into the future or plan to, there are some costs to consider building into your budget. If you purchase high-end specialized equipment, it's probably worth the price to have a service contract to ensure that the equipment is well functioning and properly calibrated by professionals. Even if you don't have a service contract, there will likely be maintenance or repair to have equipment fixed due to accidents or common wear and tear. In the end, even if you don't require those, but you plan on having an ongoing digitization program, you will eventually need to either upgrade or replace equipment as it fails, as better equipment becomes available, or as you expand your digitization program. Aside from the hardware, also consider replacement costs for disposable supplies. Supplies like nitrile gloves, light bulbs, and other material either get used up or fade over time. It's important to build specific amounts or buffers into your budgets to account for the expected and unexpected costs. Last, we will need platforms to manage, digitally preserve, and provide access to our digital content over time. We may need to pay for a collections management system or a digital asset management system, and we might need to pay for a digital hosting platform for access, depending on our own needs and our tech savviness. Luckily, we are getting to the point where all of these may be combined into a single platform, where your metadata, digital preservation, and access platforms are all integrated. Even now, many of the CMS options have content hosting, and DAMs include more robust metadata and digital preservation integration. Whatever platform or platforms we're using, we'll also need to pay staff to manage these and our files over time. You'll need to perform fixity checks a few times a year, and as we'll remember, fixity checks are validating checksums to ensure that nothing has changed or been corrupted over time. And if they have, then you'll need to be replaced from backups or other storage. Eventually, you'll also need to migrate file formats over time as file formats do become obsolete or better options become available. Remember, digitization is not a one-time cost. It is a long-term commitment to your digital collections. All right, that was a lot. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to look at grant funding opportunities for digitization. When you're looking to fund a digitization project or program, grant funds can be a great way to jumpstart a program or provide resources to complete a project. Depending on the type of material to be digitized, there are often grants specific to supporting digitization of that material, such as newspaper or audiovisual materials. But that's often not the case for what people have in their collections or a bulk of what's in their collections. So if you're not looking for grants for specialty or rare formats, how do you find grants that cover digitization? Often you have to read the fine print. Most grants aren't called digitization grants or even have digitization in the title, but there are several key words you can look for to help identify grants that will suit your needs. Phrases like digital access or access to information or history or collections are all phrases to keep an eye out for. Grants for cultural heritage organizations will often have multiple tracks within a specific grant that are focused on various topics, and access is almost always one of those tracks. Luckily, technology makes it easier to search through funding calls for those keywords. If you search through allowable costs for digitize, you can immediately tell if a grant would cover digitization under the umbrella of the grant. That way you will save time by not looking for something that will digitize if it's not an allowable cost. In addition to access, keep an eye out for preservation terminology as well. Preservation or preservation reformatting are terms that would indicate grants that support digitization, even if it doesn't explicitly say it's for digitization. It may be a necessary byproduct. If you're looking for a digitization supporting grant in Michigan, the first option I'd like to recommend is the Library of Michigan's Improving Access to Information grant. And if you're interested in applying for the grant this year, you have about 3.5 hours to get your application in. This grant is offered annually, and awards range from $5,000 to $25,000 to support digitization-related projects for eligible public and academic libraries. If you're not one of those two institution types, you can always look for opportunities to partner with public or academic libraries on projects. This grant covers digitizing almost all formats, but it does explicitly exclude newspaper digitization. If you're interested in having newspaper digitized, the Library of Michigan provides IMLS funding to help support CMU's Digital Michigan Newspaper Grant Program. This grant is offered annually and covers digitization of and online access to previously microfilmed newspapers, or microfilming, scanning, and online access to Michigan print newspaper. Awards for this grant are through a combination of a nominating process and a Twitter voting process in which 2 organizations are selected to have their content digitized and made available. Finally, many public library cooperatives offer grants that cover purchasing equipment that can be used for digitization. I recommend checking with your individual cooperatives to see what grants are available for you. There are also many grant funding opportunities for digitization offered at national or regional levels. I'm not going to read through all of these, but here are some of the key grant funding organizations to explore if you're looking for digitization grants. This list is by no means exhaustive, so please feel free to explore on your own. Some funders have just one applicable grant, while others have several that cover digitization. You can explore specific grants on the Library of Michigan's digitization page under the funding section for a list of known digitization-specific grants. On the plus side, there are many national and regional grant opportunities available. On the negative side, they are highly competitive and it's usually only offered once a year, but that doesn't mean it's hopeless. I know a lot of organizations are intimidated by these sorts of grants, but they are attainable. Just this year, a public library in Michigan received a CLEAR grant for digitizing content in their collection. You might also think that these grants are larger than what you would need for a digitization project, but many have floors as low as $5,000, which can quickly be met when considering staff time and equipment. If you do decide to apply for a grant, I'm available to help as you plan and provide feedback on your application, so please don't hesitate to reach out. Okay. Last, we're going to look at non-traditional funding options. As I said, grants can be a great way to get the funds you need, but they are also competitive, usually only offered annually, and account for a small percentage of overall funding. But the work of preservation is never done. Cultural heritage organizations are no strangers to asking for financial support, but sometimes it's easier to ask for smaller, specific amounts. This is one of the reasons that the Northeast Document Conservation Center developed its Creative Fundraising for Preservation Toolbox. This toolbox is focused on fundraising methods beyond traditional methods. Adopt an artifact, crowdfunding, personal appeal, social media, creative marketing, and community engagement are the creative tools they recommend for funding your conservation or digitization project. I'm only going to focus on 2, adopt an artifact and crowdfunding, as the rest are methods that are likely already very familiar to you all. Adopt an artifact is a great way for donors or supporters to feel a personal connection to an object or objects by directly contributing to their preservation. You can highlight a specific object or objects that need preservation or digitization and can ask donors to support that specific object. You can tell a story on your website or through social media about why this material is important and needs to be preserved, especially if it's something that needs more than simple digitization. For items that are damaged or deteriorating, Conservation work is often required before digitization and can add to the total price tag for a project. So being able to offset these costs through donors is very helpful. For example, the Meadowbrook Historic Site in Rochester, Michigan recently undertook an Adopt an Artifact program to restore the books and furnishings in their library. Some of the artifacts were objects, like portraits or furniture, that donors could adopt and receive certificates of appreciation for. I have seen similar projects where plaques with donor information were included in the object, or there was a event at the end of an event so that they could show their appreciation for their donors. At Meadowbrook, there was also an opportunity to hire an Oakland University student to digitize library material by adopting hours. Donors could adopt any amount of hours for $10 an hour. This is a great way to expand traditional Adopt an Artifact program to include digitization and at a much more manageable scale. So far, they have had 3 donors for this digitization work listed on their site, and they were able to raise enough to digitize almost 1,000 items. Crowdfunding is the practice of funding a project or venture by raising small amounts of money from a large number of people. Most of us are familiar with crowdfunding at this point, but there has been a new take on it to raise funds for cultural heritage projects. Crowdfunding has many benefits to traditional approaches to fundraising. It can be easily shared via social media platforms, such as Facebook or Twitter, or however you connect with your community. There will be a way to link to your donation page from your social media. It can reach a diverse range of donors that might not otherwise have contributed or even been familiar with your organization. It can also piggyback off partner organizations that have similar interests and communities to your own. You can also use it to build relationships through social media to interact with your partners. You can provide links to exhibits that are already online to highlight digital collections that have already been made available. Everyone always likes to see what work has already been done so they can imagine the type of work that will be done going forward. And there are many ways you can integrate crowdfunding into your fundraising, whether directly through your website or by using a platform. There are some platforms that have fees and others that are free for nonprofits, so I recommend comparing the various platforms to see what best fits your organizational needs, as well as reaching out to other organizations that might have undertaken similar projects to find out what worked for them. Becky's going to drop some links in the chat for resources on comparing various crowdfunding platforms. Whatever you pick, try to have as few clicks as possible so that people can donate easily. You can see in this example from NEDCC's crowdfunding project page to digitize the Blue Hill Observatory's climate records that there's a big blue button that takes you right to the donation page. It also has an image of material from that collection that has already been digitized, as well as images of the deterioration to highlight the need for conservation work. This page has a description of what the material is, why it's important, and how much money they're looking to raise. This is the type of content you should have on your page, just like you would with any traditional fundraising method. It's a great way to tell your story, to get people interested and invested in your project. All right, so that's it for today. Just to recap, digitization projects have costs that are both upfront and ongoing, so make sure that you plan for each. Pilots are a great way to estimate costs, so use the pilots and other available tools to estimate your labor costs. You should explore grant opportunities both locally and nationally. If you do so, look beyond the term digitization to find applicable grants. And don't hesitate to use non-traditional fundraising methods to expand your donor community. All right. What questions do you have for me? Feel free to either drop them in the chat or unmute yourself and we can go from there. No question?
I asked the question about the book handler and the one photo.
Oh, Let's see. Is it the one, the physical space one?
Yes, ma'am.
I do not know what type of cradle that is, but I can look into it because that is not from our library. That is just a physical space photo that I used with the power of the internet.
Alrighty then.
Yeah. Does anyone have experience with outsourcing digitization in Michigan? Jeff asks. Yeah, feel free to unmute yourselves and we can have a conversation. I'm open to that. Jeff, are you looking for specific
No,
formats or?
the reason I ask is that we had we are looking at a multi-year digitization project, and we are working with a company right now that we actually have yet to begin with, but they've been identified as a good fit for the project that we're doing. And I'm just wondering if anybody had any experience with any of the outsourced kind of, rather than internally doing the work, having somebody else doing it. The company that we, not naming them by any means, but seem to be pretty good, highly recommended. And I'm just wondering if anybody has an experience with that, with driving things, taking materials to have them digitize the care that they have to take for those projects, if they have to remain in person on site to kind of oversee stuff, trust levels, all that kind of stuff. Any experience with that?
Yeah. Leslie says, yes, we have sent a VHS TV recording to be digitized and got a couple quotes from vendors out of state. It was not too painful. That's great. I will say, you know, I'm happy for other people to chime in and talk about their own personal experiences. I worked as a project manager for a digitization vendor for several years, and it really has to do with your relationship and building relationships with the people who are taking care and being stewards of your collections, because they are your collections, but the vendor that you're working with, they should be treating them as their own. They should be familiar with the type of material. They should understand that why it's important, not only from a, you know, the physical processing aspect, but really from the cultural heritage aspect. So yeah, it seems like, you know, you've already done due diligence in terms of getting, you know, a vendor that was recommended to you by other organizations. In terms of, you know, shipping materials or driving materials, shipping materials is usually fine, but if you drive it, if it's something where it's close enough to drive, it really gives you an opportunity to see the organization, to see how material is being kept, to see what their equipment is like, how it's being maintained, some things that you might not get over the phone. I would also say, in terms of that, I highly recommend doing a pilot, no matter kind of the size of the project that you're going to be doing, so that you can actually have proof that what, you know, they're saying that they can do is what they can do, and what the files you're getting back are what you're expecting. So I would definitely check in with them, see if they do a pilot, you know, somewhere 5 to 10 objects, depending on what it is, and that'll give you a really good feel for the overall process and their communication style and that sort of work. Yeah, Leslie also says, are you aware of any upcoming thematic trends that granting organizations are going to be looking for in the near future for digitization projects and small history organizations? Yes, I would say that if there is a way for you to highlight any sort of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or social justice aspects in the content that you are going to be applying for a grant to digitize, funders are very interested in funding those projects right now. That is something where you know, your collections just might not cover those, but if there are ways that you can maybe reframe or refocus what you are hoping to have digitized on any of those, that also includes underrepresented communities. So I know that Michigan, we have a lot of rural communities, and we have a lot of workers from underrepresented groups traditionally. When you're looking at something like what large academic universities collect and the type of people that they collect about, they're often not from rural communities or laboring communities. So that's a really good opportunity, especially for your local history collections, to highlight some of the underrepresented communities that we're coming from. So there's that. Let's see. Christopher asks, is there any other newspaper digitization grant source besides CMU because of their lottery process? There are not really, besides really, really large ones that are mostly geared towards entire statewide digitization, newspaper digitization programs. So it's usually one per state, and it's usually from a large organization, either the state library or the state archives. So I don't have any yet, but you are not alone. There are many, many organizations that reach out about getting their newspapers digitized. I always recommend, though, that you confirm ahead of time whether or not the material, your newspaper material, has already been digitized, because a lot of them are already available. The Central Michigan University has a newspaper portal that has an index of every newspaper that's available digitally, whether it's open and a free resource or behind a paywall. So at least you know whether or not it's available.
Sadly, University Microfilm's paywall has risen drastically over the years.
Yeah, it's unfortunately something that is inhibiting access to a lot of our history. So that's something that we're looking into, is ways that we can continue to provide access to digital newspapers or expand digitization opportunities. So it is something that we are looking into at the library. Does anyone have any other questions or comments on what we've been discussing? No? Okay. Well, our next webinar will be metadata for digital collections. It's going to be on Tuesday, June 28th, and we'll drop the link in the chat to register for that. But I would like to say thank you to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for making this project possible. Again, I know I made a joke about it, but the Library of Michigan's Improving Access Information Grant does close today at 5 p.m. So if you were planning on applying for it, there is still time. Feel free to get that application in. Becky's also going to drop a link in the chat to the survey. So if you could fill that out, it will help us improve our programming, and we'd really appreciate it. But if you have any other questions or anything like that, please feel free to contact me via phone or email. I'm happy to help you with your digitization project, grant applications, or anything like that. So thank you all for attending today, and I look forward to seeing you next month.